All right, everybody. Welcome to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Library and Archives. How are you guys doing tonight? I know it's a library, but it's a rock and roll library. How are you doing tonight? Amazing. Oh, that's so much better. I'm so glad that you are all here for our AMS lecture series. Tonight, we will get into our lecture series in a minute, but first I wanted to go through some exciting things happening at the Rock Hall. If you've been paying attention to the news, you know that this week we announced our slate of nominees for 2019. I really like this class because it's so diverse. I mean, you've got everyone from Def Leppard to Janet Jackson to Rage Against the Machine to the Zombies. So you have a lot of people who are first-time nominees. You have some people who've been nominated a bunch, and I think it's going to be a pretty good class of inductees. If you would like to voice your choice on who you think should be in, stop by the Rock Hall and you can actually vote on our third floor in our new Hall of Fame floor. And you can also vote once a day on rockhall.com. We have some events coming up. We've got the Neo Sound, Northeast Ohio Sound Home Movie Day. So basically what this is a bunch of locals, mainly around Cleveland, donated footage to us from classic concerts, ranging from Bruce Springsteen and to the World Series of Rock. So we, on August 20th, over at the museum in the Foster Theater at 2 p.m., are going to be showing sort of the best of that footage that we got. So this is really never before seen footage that features a lot of great rock and rollers. Another event, we have an author series event coming up with Anthony DeCurtis. And he's going to be talking about his new book all about two-time Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee Lou Reed. So that is free with your RSVP, and that also happens over at the museum. We have another author series event coming up with Fran Belkin. Called about his book, Rock This Town, backstage in Cleveland. So again, another local Cleveland event. So if you're interested in learning about Cleveland rock and roll, you should go to these couple events. A third author series we have coming up, a friend of mine, actually, Norma Coates, is going to be talking about rock on TV, which is in conjunction, actually, with our new exhibit over at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame on floors 4, 5, and 6, called Stay Tuned, Rock on Television, where you can actually, no matter what generation you are in, you can take a trip down memory lane, because we have everything from Ed Sullivan all the way to the Monkees, and you're nodding your head. Have you seen it? I've not seen it. I'm so excited. Oh, well, you'll have to come on down, because we have a bunch of good stuff. Also, if you're looking for something to do on Wednesday nights, once a month we are having this new series called Rock Hall Nights. We just had the first one on October 3rd, and it was all about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction process. The next one is on November 7th, and it's called Play. So you'll get to play pinball in our new pinball exhibit. You'll get to play a drum set with me, because I'm a drummer. And all kinds of fun hands-on things. We also have some fun special drinks for the night and things like that. And that'll be from 6 to 9 p.m. on November 7th. But tonight we are here for the AMS lecture series. Now, AMS stands for the American Musicological Society. I am actually a musicologist, and we have a few of them scattered throughout the room. Musicology is kind of just a fancy pants word for the academic study of music. So we like to think about musical sounds and contexts and history, which is something that we like to do here at the Rock Hall all the time. Right? Our mission statement is actually to engage, teach, and inspire through the power of rock and roll. And we like to do that in as many ways as possible, including bringing great scholars like Sara Gulgas here to talk. Her talk tonight is called Baroque Rock, an embarrassing stain on rock's harder image. And actually, another good friend of mine, Georgia Cowart, is going to introduce Sara tonight. We're honored to have Georgia here. She is actually the vice president of the American Musicological Society, but we're lucky enough to have her in Cleveland, Ohio all the time, because she is also a professor, and actually one of my professors at Case Western Reserve University. So please put your hands together and welcome Georgia Cowart.
Thank you all so much, and so delighted to be here tonight, and delighted to have Sara here and her family and friends from Youngstown. I think it's going to be a great evening. So just a word about our joint venture of the American Musicological Society and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame archives, museum, and the library and archives. Jointly, we like to present a lecture every year, which highlights elements of the Rock Hall's mission and also special things from the archives and the library. So I'm a Baroque music scholar. I am a musicologist, and I think that one reason I was invited to introduce Sara is that there is a very tenuous connection between what I do and what she does. It's thin, but anyway, I'm honored to be here, and we're so proud of having this library and archives here in Cleveland. A lot of our case students, some of whom are here tonight, have really benefited from this, and we're so grateful to the Rock Hall and to the library and archives. So Sara Gulgas is an assistant professor at the University of Arizona, where she teaches courses on American popular music and jazz. Sara's research interests and publications range across the areas of popular music studies, film and media studies, memory studies, and the sociology of music. And those interests come together in her current work on a monograph entitled Baroque Rock and the Memory Politics of Musically Representing the Past, from which her talk tonight is taken. Sara is a trombonist by training and has performed in orchestras, wind ensembles, brass bands, early music ensembles, jazz ensembles, musical theater orchestras, a ska band, and an Afro-pop group. As a native of Youngstown, Sara has been a frequent visitor to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Museum since she was 12 years old, and she tells me that her positive experiences there inspired the career path that is bringing her back to us this evening. As Mandy mentioned, her talk is entitled Baroque Rock, or Baroque, an embarrassing stain on rock's harder image. Question mark? And I guess we'll find out the answer to that question tonight. Please join me in welcoming Sara Gulgas.
Working. Okay. Everybody, okay, we're good. Perfect. Thank you for everyone for coming. So The Beatles in My Life appears to be a straightforward folk rock ballad, at least until it is interrupted halfway through by what sounds like a harpsichord solo that seems to call from the 18th century.
Out of all these friends and lovers, there is no one compares with you, and these memories lose their meaning when I think of love as something new. Though I know I'll never lose affection for people and things that went before. I know I'll often stop and think about them. Love you more.
Many of us have heard this song so many times that the strangeness of this moment has been smoothed over by familiarity. But if we were able to hear it anew, we might be surprised to hear an instrument associated with old world aristocracy encroaching on the rock soundscape. From the start, the song's lyrics meditate on the past and the bittersweet feelings evoked by recollection. It is only when the lyrics shift to John Lennon's recognition that memories lose their meaning when faced with the reality of the present that the listener is sonically transported back in time. This musical manipulation of chronological time is a sonic manifestation of memory's ability to reconstruct the past in order to influence present perceptions. Baroque instrumentation and style are not sounds one would expect from a genre whose raucous beats were once accused of degenerating the youth. This curious sound combination is known as Baroque rock because it blended the sound of string quartets, harpsichord riffs, and contrapuntal techniques with rock instrumentation. Oh, it's going to do that again. It was used not only by the Beatles, but by many other rock groups, including the Kinks, the Rolling Stones, the Left Bank, Procol Harum, and the Doors, just to name a few. This is in no way an exhaustive list because we would be here forever. But why would these rock artists, later praised for creating revolutionary music and breaking away from traditional society, turn to the sound of a distant past? In this talk, I argue that Baroque rock artists utilize stylistic representations of the past, not out of a desire to return to a simpler time, but to react against modernism, mainstream society, and traditional norms. Baroque rock's incorporation of a high art form drew the attention of cultural figures such as music critics and even Leonard Bernstein and the Queen of England, who assigned aesthetic value to rock and explained it to the mainstream adult audience it initially resisted. The subgenre is left out of historical narratives because it is seen as an embarrassing stain on rock's harder image due to marketing expectations and the race, class, and gendered implications of respectability politics. Today, I will document the cultural, social, and historical implications of an overlooked subgenre that is mentioned but in passing in popular music scholarship. Even though the Beatles were not the first to incorporate Baroque instrumentation and style into rock, In My Life was clearly a watershed moment in rock music history for its Baroque influences, as well as its success with studio experimentation, as evidenced by its influence on producers and artists. Baroque rock became a trend in the mid-1960s in the sense that most rock bands wrote at least one song that incorporated the new style, or at the very least included a harpsichord, sometimes for no reason at all. While string ensembles and harpsichords entered the popular music soundscape before the 1960s, they had never really appeared in the genre of rock, and certainly not performed in a style associated with Johann Sebastian Bach. In a 2013 Wall Street Journal article entitled Bach and Roll, How the Unsexy Harpsichord Got Hip, Mark Myers argues that pop producers added the harpsichord sound to, quote, mimic the Beatles or just sound in sync with the British invasion, unquote. The Beatles' experimentation with the sound, coupled with their popularity, resulted in the Baroque rock's conflation, with the British invasion. But unfortunately, this ignores American artists, such as bands who participated in creating sort of Baroque rock sounds. Even the Beach Boys, who are typically seen as just a surf rock group, their song When I Grow Up included a harpsichord, for example. And then you have female artists, specifically from the Brill Building and Motown, either using Baroque sort of references or having string arrangements into their tunes. So the first example I'm going to play for you is A Lover's Concerto by the Toys, which references Bach's Minuet in G. And if you didn't get the melodic reference to that, you would get it because there is a giant bust of Bach staring at them as they're singing in this video. And then the second example I'm going to play for you is Will You Love Me Tomorrow by the Shirelles, who also include one of these string arrangements I was discussing before. These string arrangements designed to signal respectability as a female responsibility and question respectability's association as a white middle-class value were eventually appropriated by rock artists and played a large role in rock's transition into a respectable art form. Major rock bands initially feared embarrassment due to the perceived incongruity between classical music's pretensions and rock's associations with anti-intellectualism. The embarrassment of including a sound that has historically signified whiteness, femininity, and upper-class ambitions into rock, and thus subsequently leaving the subgenre out of rock history, once again erases, or at the very least diminishes, the impact of American Black and female artists on the so-called British invasion. In this talk, you're going to hear me use the phrase Baroque rock artists to refer to bands who identified themselves as Baroque rock groups, as well as bands who occasionally created hit songs with Baroque instrumentation and style. For example, once the Left Bank single Walk Away Renee garnered national attention in 1966, reporters and critics were quick to find a name for the relatively new sound, and they landed on Baroque rock. The group was marketed as innovators for a pluralistic style. A statement from the publicity department of Smash Records reads, quote, "Time was when string quartets were reserved for chamber music concerts or drawing room soirees. The same went for harpsichords and all other such instruments of the Baroque. No more. Such instrumentation is now found in the mainstream of beat music, and it's providing the impetus for a new renaissance in pop music," unquote. However, the Left Bank did not see themselves as innovators of a new style, but rather as a logical progression from what the Beatles were releasing at the time. While critics used Baroque rock and Baroque pop interchangeably to refer to bands like the Left Bank, who frequently used Baroque instrumentation and style, more mainstream bands like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles were the first to introduce the style into rock. Now, if I can go back to In My Life, because it's going to provide a jumping off point for the rest of this talk. The Beatles producer George Martin referred to John Lennon often as an Arl Salvador Dali, because George Martin and EMI engineer Jeff Emmerich were responsible for translating Lennon's often vague requests for a desired sound onto a record. Some famous examples include wanting to smell the sawdust on the floor for being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, wanting to sound like the Dalai Lama singing on top of a mountain 25 miles away for Tomorrow Never Knows, and my personal favorite, wanting a song to sound like an orange. However, Lennon's directions were arguably more direct in reference to In My Life. He requested that the middle section of the song be something Baroque sounding, and later recalled, quote, "We would say, play like Bach or something, so George Martin would put 12 bars in there," unquote. Lennon's description highlights two words that will be the basis for the rest of this talk, Baroque and Bach. The first word refers to a time period and or style, while the second refers to arguably the most familiar figure to stand in for that entire stylistic period of music. So we'll start with something Baroque sounding. What does that mean? In My Life and other songs in the Baroque rock subgenre imitated the stereotypical sound of the Baroque period through the use of particular instrumentation. So often you're going to hear harpsichords, string quartets, flutes, oboes, piccolo trumpets, the list could go on and on. So for my first example, I'm going to play just a short clip of Touch Me by the Doors, and you're going to hear both the harpsichord and strings.
I'm gonna love you till the heavens stop the rain. I'm gonna love you till the stars fall from the sky. For you and I.
So often these bands didn't just, and you probably noticed this, didn't just use Baroque instrumentation, but they also used the style of the Baroque period. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So you have ornamented melodies, so they're changing or embellishing the melody in some way. And you're also going to get broken chord riffs or just a rapid alternation between several notes in the chord. And both of these things can be heard in the second example, which is really short, Light My Fire by the Doors. So you'll hear the ornamented melodies first, and then it'll go into that broken chord riff. I told you it was really short. And then the third example, we're going to get fugues and contrapuntal lines, and what that means is, so you're going to have, what I want you to listen for is 2 guitars, and they're going to be playing 2 independent melodies, so 2 totally different melodies, but they relate to each other harmonically. So even though they're different, there is a relationship between them. And this is from Summertime by Big Brother and the Holding Company. So the Baroque style of music has historically been associated with the aristocracy in the distant past. In particular, the harpsichord's associations with royalty, wealth, and power have remained from the 16th to the 18th century, during which the instrument appeared in cathedrals, theaters, and became collector's objects for nobles. Let's see if it'll let me do this. Nope. Sorry. Popular representations of the harpsichord have not changed much, as the instrument is either depicted as a dusty relic of Old World Europe, hauntingly exotic in its pastness, or as an object of wealth accompanying fancy dinner parties in hundreds of movies and television shows. A contemporary example is a 2016 Taco Bell commercial that utilizes these aforementioned associations to promote the elevated value of their dollar menu. I was an undergrad too. I understand. The commercial juxtaposes the inexpensive items of a fast food chain with 17th century aristocracy, and it juxtaposes the distant past with the modern day through a remix version of J.S. Bach's Harpsichord Concerto No. 5.
From breakfast to late night, 20 decadent cravings, like the bacon-grilled breakfast burrito and shredded chicken mini quesadilla. $1 all day at Taco Bell. Let the feast begin.
Free advertising. In rock music, the harpsichord's Baroque stylization was also utilized to signal the instrument and period's associations with high-class sophistication and an antiquated sound. These 2 markers of instrumentation and Baroque style were perfect for questioning high-low distinctions of art and the time-traveling aspect of nostalgic memory. Whether or not artists used harpsichords or synthesized keyboards designed to sound like harpsichords is irrelevant. A simulation of Baroque instrumentation and style was enough to achieve the desired effect of directing the listener's attention to these aforementioned associations in order to subvert them. So for example, George Martin actually performed the solo from In My Life on a piano down at half normal speed and played back at double speed, quote, because you get a harpsichord sound by shortening the attack of everything, unquote. Because the solo is played back at double speed, the listener associates the sound with a harpsichord until the descending melody at the end spins faster and faster out of control, revealing the existence of a pre-recorded tape. So just so we can hear that again. So I hear that last part as a sonic representation of misremembering, when recollections of the past are revealed to have been imagined through the construction of nostalgic memories. In the case of In My Life, Lennon admits he will continue to remember the people and experiences of his past, but his lover will remain the focal point of those memories. Many scholars point to 1965 as the year Baroque rock began, most likely due to the popularity of In My Life, Yesterday, and As Tears Go By, which we'll talk about soon. 1965 is also the year that many rock bands experienced LSD for the first time. Psychedelic drugs, among other hallucinogens, not only increase awareness and consciousness, but also sentimentality and sensitivity, which accounts for nostalgia's relationship with the psychedelic experience and artists' decisions to write about their childhood and/or earlier times. The lyrics of In My Life and As Tears Go By detail the stories of young men looking back fondly on their childhoods and mourning the passage of time. However, the music that accompanies these lyrics offers a different interpretation. When paired with the lyrics, the music suggests that a return to the past would be less than desirable. Other than music from the British music hall tradition, they primarily used music from the Baroque period, which they've never experienced, to represent and refer to a past that they had experienced. This musical choice is ironic because lyrics of sentimentality toward the past are paired with detached, strict Baroque counterpoint rather than smooth, flowing melodic lines, creating a cognitive dissonance between the lyrics, what the lyrics suggest, and what is understood from the music. Baroque rock artists participated in what I refer to as postmodern nostalgia, which is an ironic interpretation of history that references an unexperienced past in order to alert the listener about the dangers of nostalgic memory. They utilize stylistic representations of the past not out of a desire to return to a simpler time, which is often what we think of when we think of nostalgia, but like I said before, to react against modernism, mainstream society, and traditional norms. For instance, Baroque rock artists did not draw on Baroque elements because of some desire to return to the life and times of the 1600s, but rather because the Baroque style belongs to the classical canon and recalls a past so distant from contemporary society that nostalgic feelings for it would seem absurd. The Kinks, particularly lead singer Ray Davies, wrote songs about returning to the conservative or pre-modern past, but in a way that was absurdly exaggerated. So some examples: Ape Man, he wants to return to a pre-evolutionary past. In Animal Farm, he wants to return to sort of this idea of being an animal and not having to worry about anything. And then we're going to talk about the Village Green. So Davies does not provide authorial guidance and instead leaves the listener to laugh at or evaluate the conservative spouting dry caricature. The Kinks' use of caricature humor was camouflaged nostalgia that critiqued political structures at the same time that the Beatles and Rolling Stones were releasing more direct critiques, such as Revolution and Street Fighting Man. Ray Davies viewed the heady promises of peace and love in the San Francisco scene as, quote, a carrot held up to the youth to distract us so that we would not rebel against the ruling classes, unquote. In response to this distraction, Davies questions nostalgia for an idyllic past and utopian visions of the future through an imaginary Village Green metaphor in the album The Kinks Are the Village Green Preservation Society. Village Green describes the imaginary green space through a Baroque framework and multiple temporalities. It tells a story about Ray Davies' departure from his childhood home, told through the perpetual present as his mind shifts from descriptions of the past and hopes for a future return. The song's alternation between verse and chorus acts out Davies' narration as the first verse is told in the past, the second in a preserved past, and the last verse in the future, all while returning to choruses that place him in a self-reflexive present. Even though Baroque instrumentation is present in the contemporary choruses, the harpsichord forgoes its leading melody and excessive embellishments to blend with the guitar, leaving the choruses to sound far more contemporary in relation to the Baroque-sounding verses. The chorus's contemporary sound aligns with a lyrical transition from past descriptions to present self-reflexivity, as Davies lists everything he misses about the Village Green. Returning to the Baroque sound in the second verse while describing the present situation of American tourists descending on the green also suggests a preservation of the past. The Village Green has become a tourist location that presents or represents a pre-modern imaginary simple past, which is preserved like a museum artifact. Davies recognizes that much like stepping into a museum of preserved artifacts, he and the tourists can enter the Village Green in order to hide in a nostalgic oasis of imagined traditions. Davies mocks the Southern American accents of the tourists and their need to take photographs, which is yet another preservation tool. Just like the tourist photographs, memories can come with limited frames and filters, resulting in the preservation of idealized images and misrepresentations of the past. So I'm going to play starting the second verse, and then it's going to go into a chorus that's going to sound more contemporary, and then go into the final verse.
All the houses are rare antiquities. American tourists come to see the Village Green. They snap their photographs and say, "God darn it, isn't it a pretty scene?" And Daisy's married Tom, the grocer boy.
While the song's Baroque sound evokes a distant past, the past it represents is so far removed from the past of Davy's childhood that it seems anachronistic. This anachronism is particularly present in the last verse, when his dreams of a utopian future return to his hometown, is accompanied by Baroque style and instrumentation. Even Davy's eventual return to the space results in him talking about the green as it once was, rather than how it is.
The lady of the...
Down, that's not working. Okay, there we go. Another way to understand postmodern nostalgia is through the rise of Renaissance fairs and the Society for Creative Anachronisms in the early to mid-1960s. For example, the Society for Creative Anachronisms' first gathering in 1966 was designed as a protest against the 20th century, operating as a reactionary stance against modernism, technology, and societal norms. While it appears the organization is trying to escape the present, they are consciously contemporary in their reference to popular culture. They juxtapose romantic notions of the Victorian era with jokes about plague, religious wars, and despotism, thus demonstrating an awareness of dominant narratives and the influence contemporary culture has on their reconstructions. Also, ideally, the medieval past is presented as a solution to the troubled present, but anti-medievalism is very much like postmodern nostalgia because it exposes this idealization as a ludicrous construct. Perhaps the most familiar example of anti-medievalism is Monty Python and the Holy Grail, because it parodies films that idealize myths of the Middle Ages, such as chivalry, and a nostalgic view of feudalism. So here is an example.
The lady of the lake, her arm clad in the purest shimmering samite, held aloft Excalibur from the bosom of the water, signifying by divine providence that I, Arthur, was to carry Excalibur. That is why I'm your king.
Listen, strange women lying in ponds distributing swords is no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony.
So the irony of a character from a historically distant, antiquated society recognizing the troubles of our contemporary, presumably progressive society forces us to contemplate our relationship to the past. Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the Society for Creative Anachronisms, and Baroque rock all operate within this framework that calls attention to the memory politics of constructed historical narratives and socio-political hierarchies, while treating the simple nostalgic yearnings for a pre-civilized period as absurd and undesirable. As we've seen, postmodern nostalgia and the way it reflected on the past were not reserved for music alone. Music and fashion of the 1960s in America and Britain exoticized and pluralized other cultures as well as other time periods, and usually the distant past. There was a sense of historical eclecticism in which people were less concerned about what historical period a style came from than about recycling the all-encompassing past and incorporating it into a new context with an ironic sensibility. The fashion obsession with the past, what Raphael Samuel refers to as retro chic, began as anti-fashion because it, quote, wanted to be outrageous, shocking the salons by its irreverence towards the pretensions of high art, flouting public decorum by ignoring the conventional boundaries of sex or class, unquote. Baroque rock artists and those participating in the countercultural sensibility appropriated the Baroque era's fashions, which included usually a coat, waistcoat, breeches, the ornamental ruffles on the front of the shirt. So if you look on the right-hand side of the television, that is a screenshot of the promotional video for the Beatles' Penny Lane, which, if you know the song, has actually a Bach trumpet solo in it. But as you can see, there are people dressed in Baroque fashions giving them their instruments. And then the middle picture is Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones. Obviously, the pants are very 60s, but the top is referencing the Baroque style. And then all the way on the left, you have the cover of the Left Bank's second album, The Left Bank 2. And this particular aesthetic is also portrayed in the promotional video for A Whiter Shade of Pale by English rock group Procol Harum. A Whiter Shade of Pale was released in 1967, and it reached the #1 position on the UK charts and the #5 position in the US before becoming one of the best-selling singles in history. Procol Harum was marketed differently than the Left Bank, despite both groups drawing inspiration from Baroque music, and critics categorizing their sound as Baroque rock. Whereas the press release for the Left Bank suggested they were bringing Baroque instrumentation into the genre of mainstream rock, Procol Harum's press release distanced the band from anything that had come before. The press release states, quote, "To cope with Procol Harum, unlearn the rules, discard your recall of all other senses, pay no attention to precedent, dissociate yourselves from what has gone before, and believe me," unquote. This suggests they were specifically marketed to an audience who was attracted to the idea of displacing categorical divisions. A Whiter Shade of Pale incorporates postmodern nostalgia, but in a way that offers a literal interpretation of a perpetual present, which views time as surreal. The song represents reflections of the past as not necessarily undesirable, but as a possible hallucination or dream. The lyrics of the song refer to a dreamlike state by documenting the in and out of consciousness moments that accompany a drunken evening. The space between dream and reality is sonically described through the organ's stylistic reference to the fourth movement of Bach's Sleeper's Awake cantata, written to signal the coming of the Lord, which, in this song, becomes a signal of awakening one's perceptions and state of consciousness. So I'm just going to play, hopefully, a brief version of the Sleeper's Wake cantata by Bach. There's only 2 short lines, and then that's going to be referenced in the Whiter Shade of Pale song. This part. Okay, well, let me stop it, so we'll just listen to it. It's short. I thought it was short. Oh, there we go. Okay. Musicologist Michael Long suggests that A Whiter Shade of Pale triggers, quote, "temporally dislocative experiences of nostalgia because it does not idealize the past, nor does it problematize the present," unquote. While the song itself seems to shy away from problematizing the present, the first promotional video for A Whiter Shade of Pale does not shy away from highlighting the dangers of nostalgic memory. The video was banned from the BBC's Top of the Pops television show because it alternated between footage of the Vietnam War and the group dressed in Baroque period clothing walking around the ruins of an old English court. The band members, surrounded by the dilapidated remains of a 17th century mansion, stare into the distance and contemplate the horrible realities of the present rather than blissfully escaping into nostalgia for the distant past. The band members witness both the beautiful, elaborate stonework as well as the abandoned, crumbling structures as they walk the grounds of the courtyard. The alternation of these images represents the conflict between memory and history inherent in the act of remembering.
As the ceiling flew away, when we call out for another dream, the waiter brought a tray, and so it was that later, as the miller told his tale, that her face at first just ghostly turned the whiter shade of pale.
stopped it right there because that last line when he says, although my eyes were open, they might as well have been closed, right? And then we get that organ stylistic reference to Sleepers Awake, right? So it's connecting the Bach with the idea of being aware of what's going on in society. So the juxtaposition between current conflicts and ruins representative of the after effects of past conflicts suggests that the solution to contemporary issues is not always found in the romanticization of the past. So while we're talking about Bach, we might as well move over to the second thing that John Lennon told George Martin: play like Bach. So the music of Johann Sebastian Bach has been described, in particularly a 1967 Time magazine article, as, quote, melodic but not meandering, emotional but not sentimental, unquote, which aligns with Baroque rock artists' straightforward melodies that fit within a pop song framework and their tendency to replace the sentimentality of simple nostalgia with strict counterpoint. John Lennon's invocation of the name Bach in his instructions to George Martin references previously discussed aristocratic and anachronistic associations, but with the added importance of including a canonized figure who is frequently held up as a pinnacle of the Baroque period and Western art music in general. The frequency in which something is adapted to contemporary society is directly related to its preservation, which explains why J.S. Bach is one of the most widely recognized Baroque figures to professionals and non-professionals alike. The incorporation of Bach and other figures of the Western art music canon was perceived as embarrassing for rock artists who preferred to embrace a persona that aligned with pop music's association with anti-intellectualism. In his chapter on anti-intellectualism in popular music, Ian Inglis describes, quote, a broad reluctance within popular music to claim publicly for itself anything more than a role as a mere provider of entertainment, while those outside of popular music tend to dismiss those claims which appear to endorse any greater ambition as pretentious and risible, unquote. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones initially viewed their incorporation of Baroque elements as embarrassing because these elements were perceived as sonic claims to high art's pretentiousness, which would undermine the credibility of each group's roots in working class beat music. In 1963, British music critic William Mann published one of the first articles that discussed the Beatles in terms of their music, rather than purely about the social phenomenon that they sparked. His article, which you can see on the left-hand side, which was published in the London Times, drew a musical lineage between the Beatles, pre-classical European music, and modernism. The article began a trend of finding value in rock music by favorably comparing the Beatles' songs with works from the Western art music canon. By the summer of 1965, accredited or self-proclaimed highbrow music experts placed the Beatles' name alongside the likes of Mahler, Mozart, and Schubert. Perhaps in an attempt to bring previous and recent musicological readings to life, the Baroque and Roll Ensemble released Eine kleine Beatle Musik in 1965. The album was only released in England and did not garner much acclaim, but it did influence a more highly promoted album called The Baroque Beatles Book, which was released in the same year. Both the album cover and the liner notes utilize ironic humor by displaying a cartoon version of Handel, Bach, and Telemann sitting around a table and looking over a musical score. The only part of the picture that seems remotely out of place is that Bach's overcoat is opened, revealing an I Like the Beatles t-shirt picturing the Fab Four. And for your reference, you should just read the liner notes because they're hysterical. Throughout the album, humor is found in the parodies of classical music stereotypes through both sonic and visual anachronisms. Arrangements of the Beatles' music into a classical or Baroque framework by music ensembles and music critics who compared the Beatles to composers of the Western art music canon inspired rock artists to borrow instrumentation and style from outside of their genre standards. 3 months before the release of In My Life, the Beatles released Yesterday in September of 1965. I'm sure we've all heard it, but we're just going to listen to a little bit.
Suddenly, I'm not half the man I used to be. There's a shadow hanging over me. Oh, yesterday came suddenly. Why she had to go, I don't know, she wouldn't say. I said something wrong, now I long for yesterday.
though it's not really Baroque, it was the first time classical elements became an essential part of rock rather than just a flourishing touch, perhaps due to a perception that these musical elements are an embarrassing stain on rock's harder image. This would explain why the Beatles initially feared to release Yesterday as a single in the UK. In fact, it was not released as a single in the UK until after they've broken up, not until 1976. Nor was it featured in the film Help. Instead, it was buried on the second side of the Help album just before the final track. The song was held back from being released partly because it featured only one Beatle, and they did not want to alter the group dynamic if it was perceived as a Paul McCartney single. However, they also realized that the song did not fit their image. As Paul stated, quote, "We were a little embarrassed about it. We were a rock and roll band," unquote. The band even offered Yesterday to Marianne Faithfull, but her company did not respond in time. This embarrassment was also evident in the Rolling Stones' decision to give their song As Tears Go By to Marianne Faithfull in 1964, before eventually feeling comfortable enough to release it themselves in 1965 in the midst of the Beatles' popularity with Yesterday. The song was a great departure from the blues standards they'd been recording up until this point.
It is the evening of the day. I sit and watch the children play, doing things I used to do. They think are new. I sit and watch as tears go by.
As Tears Go By was one of the first original compositions by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. Their manager, Andrew Oldham, locked the two artists in a room together until they came out with an original song, quote, "with brick walls around it, high windows, and no sex," per his instructions. I feel like it worked out. Much like the Beatles, they would release it as a single in the US before releasing it as a single in the UK a year later, but only as a B-side to 19th Nervous Breakdown. Even though the Rolling Stones wrote what would become a Baroque rock hit a year earlier than the Beatles, they would not become synonymous with the subgenre because they thought that the song was better suited for a respectable female artist rather than a rock group with a bad boy image to protect. Rock was expected to challenge the establishment's conventions. Therefore, a style of rock that was influenced by the music of the establishment and aspired to the privileged status of that music was inevitably treated with suspicion. Philosopher Bernard Gendron defines cultural accreditation as, quote, "the acquisition of aesthetic distinction as conferred or recognized by leading cultural authorities," unquote. Baroque rock's cultural accreditation is noteworthy because rock's value system is in direct opposition to the value system used to elevate Western art music. What is highly valued in Western art music reception, such as orchestral instrumentation, virtuosic instrumental sections, and multi-movement structures, is typically seen as embarrassing or met with derision in the modes of rock music reception. Canonized figures, such as Bach, held cultural accreditation, and by appropriating their music, even ironically, rock was able to gain cultural and artistic credit. Despite the fear of embarrassment, the positive reception of Yesterday extended beyond the Beatles' young fans to mainstream critics who began to take notice of the group's musicality. For instance, Yesterday is now a canonized standard of the popular music genre, and it is one of the most frequently covered songs in music history, along with classics such as Summertime and Over the Rainbow. When the Queen of England, which is, if you've noticed, pictured on the left, awarded each member of the Beatles a member of the most excellent order of the British Empire in 1965, Mike McGrady of Newsday wrote, quote, "and Queen Elizabeth has accomplished what an entire generation of parents and educators have been unable to do. In a single beautifully executed move, she made the Beatles square," unquote. The Beatles were now respected in the eyes of a royal figure, and they had been awarded the physical and metaphorical symbols of social acceptability. Critic Ellen Willis commented on the economic and aesthetic accreditation of the Beatles, quote, "When they were 4 silly kids jumping around on stage, making tons of money was a rebellious act. They were thumbing their noses at the Protestant work ethic. But once Leonard Bernstein had certified them as bona fide artists, they began in the eyes of society to deserve all of that money," unquote. Rock's cultural accreditation was not only a way to dip into the burgeoning youth market, but it was also a way to strip the movement of its power from including artists in the same economic and cultural value system of artistry that they initially resisted. Composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein, perhaps the most unexpected proponent of rock music, drew attention to rock through educational television programming. Bernstein's position as director of an established cultural institution afforded him the power to grant music the status of art and all of the privileges that come with this status. Musicologist Alicia Kampstein-Peck writes that before 1972, Leonard Bernstein, quote, "was an acolyte of tradition and could discuss any aspect of the hippies' lifestyle with impunity, authority, and the approval of parents, sponsors, the CBS network, and the Philharmonic," unquote. Bernstein was thus the perfect candidate to teach rock music to an otherwise uninterested audience. Bernstein hosted Inside Pop, The Rock Revolution, a CBS News special that aired on April 25th, 1967. His role from the Young People's Concert series was reversed, as he was now expected to understand the importance of the youth's music and explain it to their parents' generation. The program features Bernstein explaining the pop music scene to a presumably middle-aged audience.
I like the eclecticism of it, its freedom to absorb any and all musical styles and elements, like old blues.
My baby does the hanky-panky.
Or a high Bach trumpet. That's Penny Lane, Beatles. Or a harpsichord. Or even a string quartet.
His quotation of these artists on national television, and his headbanging, which was great, suggests both an attempt to provide rock music with cultural accreditation and to increase the visibility of the countercultural sensibility in the eyes of mainstream society, both of which subvert the genre's claim to hipness. During this television special, Bernstein invited 15-year-old Janis Ian to perform Society's Child, her controversial song about interracial romance. Released during the height of the civil rights movement in America, radio programmers were hesitant to play the song on the airwaves, but it soon became a hit after the airing of the special. Society's Child, like Baroque rock songs, features a harpsichord. The harpsichord in the song represents a past so distant that a desire to return to it is unfathomable, but it also represents the older generation whose ideas of racial segregation seem equally antiquated. Janis Ian lyrically positions the song's protagonist as a byproduct of a society whose oppressive ideals stifle her romantic choices, while simultaneously positioning herself on the right side of history by sonically undermining the conservative sentiments of authority figures with the backward-looking harpsichord. So this is the beginning of the song.
Shining black as night. My mother went to answer, you know that you look so fine. Now I could understand your tears and your shame. She called you boy instead of your name. When she wouldn't let you inside. When she turned and said, but honey, he's not our kind.
If the harpsichord represents the backward-looking older generation, the electric organ symbolizes technologically advanced youth that are trying to fight for change under the oppression of a society run by adults. The last refrain ends with the electric organ's chords, which are finally allowed to resolve and lead into a blues outro. So this is the ending of the song.
One of these days I'm gonna stop my listening, gonna raise my head up high. One of these days I'm gonna raise my glistening wings and fly. But that day will have to wait for a while. Baby, I'm only society's child. When we're older, things may change, but for now, this is the way they must remain. I say I can't see you anymore, baby. Can't see you anymore. No, I don't want to see you anymore, baby.
The Baroque harpsichord and blues electric organ that bookend the song depicts the generation gap of the era and the hope for the future embrace of progressive thinking. This use of the harpsichord was one of the reasons Bernstein invited Ian to perform on a show aimed at a mainstream adult audience, a group who arguably needed to hear her message the most. Drawing on respectability politics, Janis Ian includes the harpsichord with all of its race, class, gendered associations in order to represent society's privileging of bourgeois, white, patriarchal, and heteronormative ideals. By drawing on the music of high culture, Ian was able to leverage claims to cultural legitimacy. Influenced by Motown's use of string arrangements to signal respectability, Ian used the harpsichord to draw in a mainstream audience while highlighting society's reactions to race relations. After the show aired, radio stations apologized, and both the album and single climbed the national charts, reaching the top 10 due to Bernstein's laudatory praise. Scott Holtzman of the Houston Post wrote, quote, "It's going to be harder to maintain that kids are turning out trashy music when such an eminently respectable white tie guy like Leonard Bernstein is coming on strong for the incredible, talented 16-year-old writer-performer Janis Ian," unquote. In a form of grand irony, rock music, once perceived as a simple form of entertainment, gained cultural accreditation through ironic references to higher art forms, which culminated in Leonard Bernstein imploring an audience of mainstream adults to treat the genre with the utmost seriousness. Baroque rock's ironic mocking of conventional values was popular with audiences because it was accepted by the youth, but also by cultural institutions who misunderstood the classical references as serious attempts to legitimate the genre. Baroque rock's cultural accreditation led to the genre's wide acceptance among various marketing targets, while simultaneously losing its power to resist, resulting in its descent into the forgotten, embarrassing realms of rock's historical narratives. Rock critics were concerned that high art influences would undermine rock's stance against formal art. Ellen Willis of The New Yorker argued that, quote, "Rock has been co-opted by high culture, forced to adopt its standards, and thus ending rock's radical experiment in creating mass culture on its own terms, ignoring elite definitions of what is or is not intrinsic to aesthetic experience," unquote. The incompatibility between the rock genre's propensity for raging against established tradition and Baroque rock's acceptance by mainstream culture led to an embarrassing perception of Baroque rock, making it a moment in rock history that people wish to forget. The transition to hard rock with its harsh, distorted timbres, screaming vocals, and driving rhythms also forced Baroque rock's associations with acoustic timbres, light vocals, and counterpoint into the recesses of artists' memories. This embarrassment is parodied in a scene from the 1984 rock mockumentary This Is Spinal Tap, which documents hard rocker Nigel Tufnell's humiliation upon hearing an oldies radio station play a little bit of his past.
You might want to come next door. The radio's playing a bit of your past.
They filmed me? I don't believe it!
way back to 1955, that one. Doesn't it feel good? With the Thamesmen and Cups and Cakes.
You're an
Of course, the
oldie.
Thamesmen later
You're an
changed their
oldie.
names to Spinal Tap. They had a couple of
Yeah.
nice-sized hits. They're currently residing in the Where Are They Now file. Johnny Q with you on Golden 106, and right after we drop.
Rock you.
The humor in the scene not only comes from Nigel's reaction to the song, but also the song's exaggeration of the Baroque rock style, which draws attention to the stylistic markers found in familiar Baroque rock hits and points to actual key moments in Yesterday, Eleanor Rigby, Penny Lane, As Tears Go By, and the lyrics are a parody of Peter and Gordon's Sunday for Tea. This scene is also a moment of art imitating life, as Michael McKean, who's the one on the right, who plays David St. Hubbins in the film, briefly joined the Left Bank in 1967, playing guitar in the singles And Suddenly and Ivy Ivy, if you're curious. Also, Steven Tyler from Aerosmith was briefly in that band, which is also fascinating. But it is appropriate that Baroque rock was both inspired by and humiliated by canonization and cultural accreditation. Musicologists, scholars, and other intellectuals who were willing to analyze the Beatles' music as they would classical music rather than dismiss it as a fad, not only inspired early music ensembles to create Baroque renditions of rock songs, but also inspired rock artists to create music in a Baroque style, albeit with an ironic twist. Baroque rock poked fun at high-class pretensions, canonic works of art, and nostalgic dreams of an imagined past, but all of this was hidden beneath classical-sounding music that ran counter to rock's working-class hard aesthetic. Blending rock and classical music attracted both hip consumers looking for the newest form of eclecticism and parents who wanted a softer version of rock. The same accreditation that sparked the subgenre would eventually result in recognition from cultural leaders such as the Queen of England and Leonard Bernstein, drawing the attention of more mainstream audiences and opening up the possibility for the commodification of the sonic aesthetic. And as you heard, he kept calling him an oldie, so we have to talk about that. It is ironic that by the end of the decade, Yesterday, a song that inspired Baroque rock, would be featured on soft rock radio stations aimed at adults. Many Baroque rock hits were and continue to be in the lineup for these radio stations, as well as oldies radio stations aimed at the baby boomer generation. I was introduced to these songs through my parents as we listened to these radio formats while I was growing up in the 1990s. In some ways, I experienced nostalgia for the 1960s through post-memory, as I remember the lived memories my parents shared with me about the decade. Even though I love the music and my parents' fond memories, they have also shared not so fond memories of hiding under their school desks in preparation for a nuclear explosion, learning about the Kent State shootings as young adults living only 39 miles away, and watching riots in the streets after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. I recognize that a return to those times is impossible, undesirable, and will not solve our current problems despite any similarities. It is perhaps the greatest irony that oldie stations designed to sell nostalgia to the baby boomer generation in hopes of reliving moments of their lives in the 60s are playing Baroque rock hits that poke fun at this desire for nostalgia as a solution to contemporary problems. Thank you so much.
Right, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. We do have some, time for some questions. I would ask that you wait until I give you the mic and speak into the mic, not only for the recording, but also for our guests who might have some accessibility needs so that they can hear through the speakers. Any questions?
I was also curious about how the use of these kinds of instrumentation might have been influenced by, like, okay, like rock and roll has done like the more simplified instrumentation, like it just makes sense that we like do more complex things because we can. Like, how does that kind of factor into like your thesis, I guess, here?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that I didn't have time to mention. I think in that case, there's also this idea that you have recording studios, especially the Beatles with EMI, and then you have like Elektra Records and None Such Records, which are sharing recording studios. And so you have, you know, these companies that are recording both sort of classical, Baroque, you know, like records and pop records at the same time. So they could just possibly walk in, and sometimes they did, and there'd just be a harpsichord sitting there, right? So a lot of it did have to do with, oh, let's check that out and see what that's about. So there's definitely that part of it in there as well. Because I think, and it was one of the things that I found really fascinating, because I did research at the archives here, and that was one of the things I found, is that there was a lot between, for example, in New York, Elektra Records, which recorded like folk and pop music, and None Such Records, which would, release the Baroque Beatles book, but also released like traditional, Baroque recordings, and that they shared the same space. And so often that happened as well. Yeah, thank you. Georgia has.
So just picking up on that question, I was having my little nostalgia trip of my own, being your parents' age and remembering the 60s. And I remember so clearly that I was in college then and discovering Baroque music in a way. And so I was thinking, well, maybe the Beatles were doing that and incorporated. And so I looked up, how we all were so excited, I'm so embarrassed to say, about the Pachelbel canon when it was first recorded, and it was new and fresh, and the Vivaldi concerti were not known by everyone as they are now, and we were excited. It was not only old, but it was new and fresh, and so I was thinking, well, maybe the Beatles, were influenced by this revival of Baroque music, but I looked at the date. I looked up the date while you were talking of the that recording of the Pachelbel canon, which kind of started it, at least for the lay public, of which I was one at the time, and it was 1968, and so that was late. So what if the Beatles influenced the whole Baroque revival in classical music?
It definitely goes back and forth, because I find that, so there's a Bach year in 1950, I believe, and so they put out a lot of Bach recordings. So that's really where sort of the Bach in particular influence comes from, because they could go to a record store and you could have Bach, but then you could also have people who did sort of the pop music recordings of Bach, and there's the Swingle singers, and so I think it did that, and then it went over to pop, and then you're absolutely right. I think there's this sort of mutual influence going back and forth between the two, absolutely.
But I also think that there is, it would be interesting to look with the whole respectability thing, because Baroque music wasn't as respectable as 18th and 19th century, or late 18th century and 19th century. And people would do drugs listening to Baroque music, and it was considered very hip and cool, and then it lost that.
Yes.
And so it would be interesting to kind of trace that parallel. Well, it sounds like you're doing that parallel.
Yeah, because Elektra Records, when I was reading about that, they kind of, I don't remember the quote in particular, but they mentioned something about, we're done with playing, overworked war horses, right? Meaning more of classical, right? And so we're going to do this kind of like what you're saying. Yeah, exactly. And then it was interesting in that 1967 Time magazine article in which Bach is on the front cover, right? He comes back.
When was that?
It was 1967, and Leonard Bernstein actually mentions that there's a young people concert series about Bach, and he brings that up as he's relevant again, right? I don't remember where I was going with this. In that particular article, they mentioned the fact that Beethoven's kind of aligned with the older generation, and that you would go to listen to Beethoven in a concert hall, whereas in Bach, that you're going to get that in recordings, and what else do you get in recordings? Pop music, right? So that was kind of the argument of that article as well. Yeah, and it talks about Wendy Carlos, and yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Excuse me. I was just wondering, have you looked at the connection with these various rock groups and folk Baroque in Britain, which was flourishing with people like Martin Carthy and Davy Graham, and there was also Pentangle and Renborn and Jansch. We know about Jansch, and he's linked to Led Zeppelin. And in fact, if I'm correct, Pentangle even toured with Led Zeppelin. I mean, all of this was swirling around. I've never really seen any link between John Lennon and those people, but that was all British, and it was very much part of it. And of course, the folk people at the time, there was this raging argument going on between traditional folk and modern folk rock, and they were kind of cocking a snoot at that group. So, I mean, all of this was also swirling. So I wonder if you looked at that. And of course, never mind Jethro Tull and all that rock parade.
Yeah, that comes later. Yeah, I haven't looked into and I need to. But thank you so much for mentioning that. That's amazing. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you. That was a really interesting talk.
Thank
and
you.
I want to come back to something you mentioned briefly, because when Georgia was talking about the recordings in 1968, it is the same year that Wendy Carlos puts out Switched on Bach.
Yeah.
And I was thinking through your talk, there were a number of times where you were thinking of that kind of postmodern nostalgia that happens through a lot of this and the way rock is looking back to the past. But Wendy does something really interesting where she marries it with the future, right? And for many artists throughout the 70s who are discovering the synthesizer, her work with Switched on Bach becomes the kind of key piece for modernism, but she's recreating all of these Bach pieces. So I wonder if you've ever done any work in that area or connected it up to some of the aspects you were talking about today.
Right, and that is what I'm working on next, because I've talked about the past, and now I want to know how the past influences the future, and even you can look at George Clinton and the Parliament Funkadelic and connecting sort of that Afrofuturism with, it always kind of connects back to Baroque, which I find really interesting, and kind of finding connections with that. But then when you're talking about Wendy Carlos, I think that's also interesting too, because there's a respectability politics involved with that, in which, because a synthesizer is such a new instrument, she actually has said, I wanted to create something where we're going to pair it with something that everybody knows. Everybody knows Bach. So we're going to take this sort of futuristic instrument, and hopefully maybe people won't hate it, right? Because it's connected with something that's respected, right? But yeah, absolutely.
And then you end up with when she does the soundtrack for Tron, which I'm sure Kate Rogers is sitting up here is aware of, right? Using some of those ideas of the fugue and all these things in the actual futuristic soundtrack. And then that gets picked up by everyone from Daft Punk and on and on and on, right?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Sarah, thanks. This was great.
Thank you.
Two things. One, at the beginning of your talk, I thought of some contemporary examples where rock is integrated into Baroque period types of things. Marie Antoinette, where they start with string quartet and turns into Susie and the Banshees, or Knight's Tale, where it starts with this sort of fake dancing and becomes David Bowie's golden years.
Right.
So there's, you can see how influential this has been even now, where they're kind of back engineering songs that were not Baroque rock, but turn them into it by virtue of how they're scoring them. So that, and I'm sure you'll deal with that eventually. But I was wondering if there are bands in particular that really, you mentioned the Left Bank not wanting to be sucked into this. And I'm wondering if there are bands that did, willingly or not, get sucked into it. I mean, the gentleman's comments about what was going on with British folk, I think, is right on. And I think of the Kinks, Village Green, and Arthur, where they are obsessed with nostalgia.
Yeah.
And Jethro Tull would be the other one. I mean, everything. Basically up until the 1980s, when they go fully electric, they're Minstrel Gallery and Stand Up, all those albums. It's all looking backward, and his main instrument is a flute, for God's sake, right? So you're already kind of predisposed to be heading in that direction. So can you talk about these bands that really just embraced it?
Right. So there's that, and I'm going to kind of answer your question, but through a different avenue. So what I have written about is sort of bubblegum rock, and finding out how this is in all of these songs. Let's kind of just jump on this bandwagon. And you have the Turtles, even though they're not what I would consider Baroque rock. There's you always have the one member who's, I think it's Mark Volman, who's always doing weird things, right? And then there's performances of him where he just sets up a harpsichord. He doesn't play it. Like he like mock plays it, and it's just there because it's it's just associated, right? And then you have even like the Banana Splits have a Baroque rock song, for God's sake. It's just they're just really jumping on that bandwagon, absolutely, to the point where when I'm writing all of this stuff, I'm just like, I bet I could just kind of like land on any band and there'd be one thing, at least one song. So I think, but the thing that it loses though in some of those, specifically the bubblegum rock sort of stuff, is they just throw in the harpsichord. So when I talked at the beginning about having the instrumentation and the style to sort of like elicit both the aristocracy and anachronism, in the bubblegum rock stuff, they're just using the harpsichord. It's not necessarily in a Baroque style at all. It's just like, oh, you expect a harpsichord, here it is. Like I'm gonna play these like rock melodies with,
So then would you say that by the 70s, Baroque rock has become a production genre? Like,
yeah.
We're going to do a Baroque, it's like side B, track 3.
Yes.
Right? And everyone just does it?
Right. And that's kind of what I found about the Spinal Tap thing is like they make fun of like almost every genre of music. I was like, I wonder if Baroque rock is, yep, there it is. like it's really short, and I didn't even notice the first 5 times I watched it, but like it's there, and I thought it was really interesting. But yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I will look further into that. Thank you.
So you mentioned the Beach Boys, God Only Knows. That came off of their Pet Sounds album. That was when they were using all the horns and did they get into the Baroque rock also, or is that just a fluke that they did?
Yeah, they absolutely did. So the one that I talked about sort of was When I Grow Up that was 1964, and then Pet Sounds is later. Right. By the way, this is my brother. He introduced me to the Beach Boys. So we can all thank him for that. So he probably knows way more than I do with the Beach Boys. But I think it's interesting that it's, so they actually do it before Pet Sounds. And then Pet Sounds, they just go even crazier in terms of, all the different instrumentation and experimenting with studio sounds and all of that. But what I do find interesting about When I Grow Up, it is sort of that idea about nostalgia, but about the future. So kind of connecting to what you're going to talk about, because you were talking about. So he's talking about wanting to grow up, and am I going to sort of lose my heart and what I believe in and all that kind of stuff. And then you have this interesting sort of like juxtaposition with the harpsichord, and again it's sort of associated with like the older generation, which I find interesting because he's almost like afraid of being an adult, right? Yeah. Sorry, did I answer your question?
Yeah, because it was interesting how they went from like the complete surf rock to
absolutely.
The classical sounds that Brian Wilson brought up.
Yeah, thank you.
So with the movie Bohemian Rhapsody coming out, how would we classify that? Would we consider that a Baroque rock, or would that be alt rock?
I've actually lost a lot of sleep over this question, because I feel like it could just be, any song could be Baroque. Initially, and I don't like to sort of like siphon myself off like Baroque rock is this one thing, right? Because then that kind of like defeats the purpose. But I think initially, in sort of like the mid-60s, to me, it had to have like the instrumentation and the style, which arguably that does, right? And then at one point I was like, well, maybe does it have to, like what happens if it references a specific, artwork? Like what if because most of what I played today, I didn't get to talk about all of it, but like most of it was references to some Bach, like even if it was like a couple lines, right? And at first I was like, well, maybe that doesn't count because then, they're not bucking the system with canonization. And then I was like, no, I can't, because then nothing's gonna, really count. So to answer your question, I don't have an answer because I don't want to sort of, limit what the definition is. I think they were influenced by what was happening here? Absolutely, 100%. Do I think that they extended it to a completely almost different thing? Absolutely. So sorry that wasn't a direct answer, but that's sort of my feelings on the subject.
Hi, I enjoyed the talk. I guess my question, so obviously a lot of these bands that did sort of Baroque influenced things also did a lot of work sort of influenced by more recent sort of historical genres, like you mentioned music hall briefly. And I guess, what do you think is sort of the difference between how they used sort of past music styles that they actually might have experienced versus those that greatly predated their existence, with like the Beatles or the Kinks or any of those bands like that?
Right. See, at first I was going to answer that with, it wasn't a stereotype, but it was still stereotyped, both genres. Like whether it was something that they experienced or they didn't experience, it was very much on like what people are going to expect from listening to this. And then they would sort of, I don't want to say exploit that, but they definitely sort of used that for how they were going to create this music. But I would say either way, it's still talking about the past. And again, it kind of connects with that idea I mentioned a little bit briefly, where there was this sort of sense of historical eclecticism where it didn't matter. Like the past was sort of the past, right? I didn't have time to go even further into sort of the retro chic fashions and, all of the, things that they were wearing, like the military garb, and what did that mean? Because you can read that as, how you're wearing the Union Jack, if you're wearing it in a way that's not of militaristic honor, that sort of thing. So that's something that even though it's not like terribly distant to them, they're still sort of taking that past and tweaking it in a certain way. So I don't think that necessarily they were concerned about like the past as in like, 20 years ago versus the past as in like the 1600s, if that sort of makes sense. Did I sort of answer your question? Okay, cool.
All right. Well, that seems like a pretty good place to end. If you're interested in checking out this lecture again or other lectures in our AMS lecture series, you can actually go to their website. It's ams-net.org, and you can see topics from 1920s popular music through the backbeat through 70s hip-hop in the Bronx. So join me in thanking Sara Gulgas one last time.
Thank you.